Human communication. You are going to study human communication this semester in the form of interpersonal communication. This is a subject, of course, that people have been studying since the beginning of time. Our discipline, or our field of study in communication, is one of the oldest fields of study. I'm going to just try to give you an overview of what human communication is and why we study it. I'm Dr. Heidi. I had hoped to do this video in a different format, but as human communication would have it, this is the way that I'm going to do it this time so that you all can at least get the information. I'm also going to post another video so you can see what it would look like if I did this in more of a presentation style format. Okay, so let's look at a little bit more about this idea of human communication. I mean, is there another type of communication? Well, I believe that there is because I talk to my dogs all the time. So we are going to learn how to define interpersonal communication. We're going to study study why communication is important, study the basic principles of human communication. We are going to learn about communication competence, the types of human communication, and mindfulness in communication. Why would we try to cram all of that into one chapter? Well, the truth is that this is the survey chapter for the entire book. So this is going to give you the highlights of the things that we will cover and how we will cover them throughout the textbook that we have for this semester. Interpersonal communication. There are many definitions and many people who have defined it, but Arthur P. Bechner defined it as at least two communicators intentionally orienting towards each other as both the subject and object whose actions embody each other's perspectives both towards self and other. The reason that this definition isn't great is really because it limits us to two communicators. Two communicators is usually considered dyadic communication, but you can have dyadic communication and interpersonal communication. And interpersonal communication can include more than two communicators. As you'll see later, there are different types of communication, and that includes different levels or groups or numbers of people. Now that you know, we are going to discuss interpersonal communication and kind of the ways that we're going to discuss it. Let's take a look at the areas of interpersonal communication. When you are looking at interpersonal communication, like I just mentioned, you want to think about the number of partners involved, the physical proximity of the communicators, the nature of the interaction, and the degree of formality or structure of the communication interaction. Proximity, in case you don't know, is how close people are to one another. The nature of interaction or interaction units is really like what kind of interaction are we having? As you can see here, these two ladies are sharing a cup of coffee, so their conversation is probably more casual in nature. Communication, to say the least, is complicated. I have been teaching communication for 24 years. I have 3 degrees in communication, 3 collegiate degrees, and there are still many things I have yet to learn about communication. But that makes it a very exciting field to study and be part of. So why do we study communication? It allows us to take the perspective of others. Sometimes I need to look at something from another person's perspective to really understand what they're getting at. It also helps us to be aware of time, the time that we have to give to one another, the time and space that we find ourselves in, the time period that we find ourselves in. All of those things are effective for communication. I don't think I'd be very effective at communicating in today's society if I was trying to write on cave walls with sticks. Yeah, it just is not the same type of communication. So we have to think about the time frame. And if we study communication, we can improve the effectiveness of our communication. Some of you may not feel like you are exceptional communicators yet. That's okay. That's why we're here. Some of you may already think you are the best at communicating. While you're here, let's take a true analysis of your communication skills so we can build on what you already have. So, why do we communicate? Well, it helps our mental and physical health. It honestly can improve the outcomes in a positive way of stress, anxiety, depression, cancer, coronary conditions, and the common cold. The thing is, it can also impact these things in a negative way. Am I saying that communication can cause or cure cancer? No, I'm not saying that. However, I am saying that people who are trying to overcome cancer or who have been diagnosed with cancer can benefit from communicating with other people, especially interpersonally, or learning how to communicate better with their healthcare providers so that they understand what they're going to need to battle cancer and not become a victim of cancer, but rather a survivor. All of these things go into why we communicate, what communication can do for us, both positive and negative. Now, I just picked out cancer, but there's also ways that communication can cause more stress, take away stress. It can honestly make the common colds come on stronger or get over it more quickly, especially if you're talking to a healthcare provider who might be able to help you choose something over the counter to get rid of the cold faster. So, why do we need to communicate with others? Well, it helps us develop our identity. When we communicate with others, we learn who we are and we learn who they are. That helps us establish and maintain relationships to be social beings. We are social creatures. By nature, humans are social creatures. So, communication with others is something we need. Communication is also practical. We can't really function without communication. If you remember uh, dealing with a baby, because you probably don't remember when you were a baby, but if you've seen a baby, babies communicate all the time, and they can't get anything done without communicating to someone else to help them, whether it's to help them change their diaper, help them get something to eat, help them change their clothes. These are things that are the very basic functions of communication, and we only build on those as we grow and develop. So what is communication? It comes from the Latin root communico, which means to share. When you're communicating, you share ideas and inform each other in the forms of verbal and nonverbal communication. Communication is symbolic. A communication scholar said, and I believe it was Marshall McLuhan, but I may be wrong, so I can look that up for you. But symbolic communication. A symbol is a representation of something. Symbolic meaning is arbitrarily assigned, and a symbol is just a mark, object, or sign that represents something. So humans are symbol using, symbol misusing, etc. Symbols are the things that we see in our everyday life, and we've given words to these symbols. Just like a stop sign is an octagon in the United States. It's red, it's outlined in white, it has the word stop on it, which means we're supposed to stop. We also have stoplights. If you have recently moved to the United States or even gone to another country, you will recognize that their symbols for stop are not always the same. When I went to South Africa, they don't even call stoplights stoplights. They refer to them as robots. We have different words to mean the same thing. So, symbols, what do they mean? Well, the meanings aren't in the words, they are in the people that communicate them. So here you have an at symbol, which at one point in time was not as common as it is today. And in fact, it also used to have a different name. What is a denotative definition? This is the definition that you will find in the dictionary. So if you look up a word in the dictionary, the denotative meaning is exactly what you will find there. The connotative meaning is what we associate with it. So if you say somebody is cool, you don't necessarily mean the dictionary definition of temperature, cold, right? You mean something different. Is communication intentional? That's the question asked by our textbook. Yes, of course communication is intentional. At least some of the time. We cannot not communicate. Although I think I have a typo here, but we cannot not communicate. So we are always communicating. No matter what, we are communicating, non-verbally or verbally. And what it really comes down to is our interpretation of another's communication, or vice versa. So is it always intentional? Not necessarily, but are we always communicating? Absolutely. There are different types of verbal and nonverbal communication, which of course we'll learn more about as the semester goes along, and from each of you as you do these teachings and recordings from our textbook. The dimensions of communication include the relational dimension and the content dimension. So as I said before, it's not always intentional and we can't stop doing it. So a relational dimension to communication is our relationship with the speaker. This influences our interpretation. So if somebody said something sarcastic to you and you took it offensively, it's probably because you don't know that person well enough to know that they're being sarcastic. The content dimension is very simple. It's actually just the content of the message. The words that come out of your mouth without much interpretation. It's like the difference between denotative and connotative. There's a relational dimension to the words that you say and a content dimension. Communication is a process. It is ongoing, it is dynamic, it is purposefully changing, it is moving toward an end goal, and it requires a series of interactions. So you can't just get to the end goal without the step-by-step process of communicating with another person. It requires a series of interactions in order to be a communicator. In order to be an effective communicator, there's a little more that we have to discuss. One of those things is the cultural influences of communication. Now, people say that communication discipline and English discipline are the same. They are not, because communication is done in many languages around the world every day. In fact, here in the town where I live of Fort Morgan, we have roughly 13,000 people who live here, which to you might seem small. To me, it's a small city, but it's still a city. Having grown up in a very small town with like 650 people, this seems rather large, but with our 13,000 people, we are the second most culturally diverse city in Colorado, only second to where you and I are at school at the Community College of Aurora. But in my community, there are 24 different languages spoken every single day. So culture is part of a learning process. It is impacted by our worldview. So what we've been taught, what we know, what we see, what we've experienced, all of that influences the communication, the way that we communicate, how we communicate, and the language we use to communicate. It also impacts our behaviors. We do things differently based on where we grew up, how we grew up, who influenced us while we were growing up, what we did while we were growing up. Some of you may have had 1,000 students in your class or 700. You wouldn't know what it was like to have only 43 kids in your class. And I wouldn't know what it was like for some of my friends who went to high school in North Dakota with only 2 people in their graduating class. It's worldview, it's perspective. There are many things that we bring to each communication interaction. Communication, though, does occur in a context. Some examples of the context include the circumstances, the environment, the setting, and the situation. I would not communicate the same in a situation with my friends sitting at a coffee shop as I would communicating with my students in a classroom. Though I am the same person and I don't try to change myself based on the situation, the setting, the environment, and the circumstance, I do likely change what I talk about, what I communicate about. I'm not sharing the same things with my students that I share with my closest friends. We need to learn how to manage these situations so that we become more competent and better communicators. Why? Because the better you are at communicating, the better you will do in your job, the more successful you will be as a significant other, as a friend, as a family member, you name it. If you're good at communication, everything in life can be better. Communication is purposeful. It always serves a purpose. Whether you know what that purpose is or not, consciously, subconsciously, there is always a purpose. And the purpose is always there regardless of intention. So if you say something and said, I didn't intend for it to come out that way, that's okay. It still came out that way. It was still interpreted by the other person that way. So there was some intention behind it. We just have to figure out then if we can correct the intention to make it seem, or to make it better, to make it more understandable, to help somebody else understand where we were coming from. Competent communicators. If you are a competent communicator, it really requires balance between appropriateness and effectiveness. Appropriate communication is what most people would consider acceptable in the certain situation where you find yourself. There are some people who would cuss on the job or use curse words. There are other people who would never even consider doing that in their career. It just depends on the situation, the people with whom you're interacting, etc. Effective communication is, can you achieve the outcome that you want based on using the most appropriate communication for the situation? That makes you a competent communicator. Do you want to be a competent communicator? Let's hope so. Since it's a soft skill that most employers are looking for, you probably want to at least achieve a certain level of competency in your communication skills. In order to become a competent communicator, you need to know that there's no universal standard. Sorry. It is based on these situational variables: your speaker style, the needs of the listeners, the context, the situation, the culture, and the type of communication. Good news, competency can be taught and it can be learned. So you can become an effective communicator and a competent one. Competent communicators are considered skillful, adaptable. They know how to persuade others appropriately. They also learn to empathize with others, putting themselves in someone else's shoes. They adjust the message to the audience, and they self-monitor. What is a self-monitor? Someone who pays attention to both their verbal and nonverbal communication. So, as I mentioned earlier, we would cover the types of human communication. There's intrapersonal communication, interpersonal communication, group communication, public communication, and mediated communication. So, intrapersonal communication is really talking to yourself. Now, does it mean you have to talk to yourself out loud? Absolutely not. Although talking to yourself out loud does count, we also communicate with ourselves internally all day, every day. Then there's interpersonal communication. This is when you talk to someone else or to a couple of other people and you have a communication interaction going on. There are also, the other types of communication. And those types of communication include intercultural communication, which is communication between one or more cultures. And there is also, interpersonal communication, intercultural communication, intrapersonal communication. There's public communication, which is communicating in like a public speaking sort of format. And then the other one is the mediated communication, the one that we are most all familiar with, our mediated communication using smartphones or other devices to communicate with one another, like I'm doing here, right? My last slide, which I sort of skipped over quickly, is on mindfulness and mindful communication. We don't have a really good definition of mindful communication in the communication discipline. So really what I think when I think of mindfulness in communication is to pay attention to one another, to focus on the time, the certain situation, the interaction that you're having, so that the right words come out of your mouth. You know, those times when you're like, oh, I shouldn't have said that. Oh, I put my foot in my mouth. Not literally, but you know what I mean, right? If you are being mindful, you are focusing on the current communication interaction and focusing on the situation as best you can. In summary, that's human communication and chapter 1. If you have questions, of course, you can feel free to ask me about it, or you can send me an email. Send it to heidi.deal@ccaurora.edu, and then I can get back to you as fast as possible. If you would prefer, we can also do a video chat, or I can call you. I look forward to getting to know you better through your teaching experiences, and look for another video posted as an example of a way to teach these chapters. I look forward to hearing from you soon.